All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's session. I'm your host, Mohammed Shanwaz, and the president of Government Blockchain Association, UAE chapter. Government Blockchain Association, or QB as it's called, is a technology agnostic global association whose mission is to promote and accelerate blockchain adoption in government sector via education, advocacy, and partnerships. We are headquartered in USA, and we have 50 chapters around the world. GBA UAE was recently started around February 2020, and since then we have hosted many thought leaders and blockchain professionals. Today we have one of the founding fathers of blockchain, but before we continue, one small disclaimer. Um, Blockchain Association is not affiliated with any government or private entity. GBA UE does not endorse any project, and it's not all advice here should not be construed as legal, financial, or investment advice, and should be seen only for educational purpose. So to welcome our founding father, the pioneer, we have our first guest, Gerard Dache, who's the president of GBA Global. Our second guest is George Sebastio, who is also a GBA advisor, at the same time CTO advisor of a confidential startup. And our third guest is Saeed Al Darmaki, who used to work for Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, and also he's the managing director of Alphabit. Our fourth guest is Kelsey Warner, who is the future editor of the National, which is the leading news service in UAE. So continuing ahead, our today's topic is on the origins of blockchain. How was the idea of blockchain or immutable records conceived? Back in late 80s, a young scientist named Scott Stornetta was reading about a fraud case in newspaper where a physical evidence was altered and tampered, and that raised a question. Uh, Anything on paper, if it's altered, you can forensically find it. But what if anything is changed in digital world? How do you find a change was made? How do you make it immutable? So that raised a question. At that time, Scott was working in Xerox and predicted that we're going to face the problem in the future. So folks, that time in 80s, if you remember, we didn't have much personal computers, and we had servers the size of huge room. So this basically incidents, this question started a journey that laid the foundation of blockchain. So for those who don't know what blockchain is a decentralized database with three main properties. It is very hard to change. It is transparent to the participants. At the same time, you can trace the provenance of any object. Uh, so the advantage over centralized system is that in central world, we trust one person or entity, and that entity can be bribed or corrupted, and there's a single point of failure. But in decentralized system, we democratize trust and we scale trust. So blockchain is finding many applications at the moment in private and public sectors. So continuing ahead on the origins of blockchain, Scott from after Xerox joined Bellcore Labs. Bell Labs, if you know, it was started by Alexander Graham Bell, who also invented the telephone. Bell Labs that time was one of the top research centers in the world. It gave us lasers, solar cells, transistors, and nine Nobel Prize winners, and more. It has more than they have more than 30,000 patents filed. So they had a lot of brilliant people working there. So when Scott joined Bellcore, he met another brilliant cryptographer. His name was Stuart Haber, and together they started working on how to make digital data immutable without the need of trusted third party. And they worked hard on this problem, but and they had some stumbling blocks. Then when they were about to give up, they found a solution. The first paper, How to Timestamp a Digital Document, was submitted around 1990, around 30 years back. It was published in 1991. Then the second paper, it was provided in 1992. By 1994, they started a company called Surety, which was the first commercialized blockchain, which is still at the moment running. In 1997, they published secured names for bit strings. So fast forward 2008. In 2008, an enigmatic person with Japanese name, Satoshi Nakamoto, published a white paper, the famous white paper, from where the Bitcoin was started. So that white paper had 8 references. 3 of the references were taken from the Scott and Stewart's work. So Scott and Stewart has worked on blockchain and its use case longer than any of us. Scott has Scott has PhD in physics from Stanford, and used to be part of Association for Advancement of Artificial Intelligence when he was in Stanford. He speaks fluent Japanese, and that caused suspicion among the Bitcoin enthusiasts that he may be Satoshi. So, is he Satoshi? Did he create Bitcoin? It does not matter. What matters is Scott and Stewart had worked years to lay and build foundation of one of the most important innovations of our time. So without further ado, it is with absolute pleasure and huge honor, let's welcome Scott Stornetta. So over to you, Scott.
Wow.
So that is I guess now we have a small presentation from Scott. So let me stop my screen and then you can start yours. Yeah.
All right. Well, again, it's obviously impossible to live up to that big of a buildup.
No way.
of that. I mean, one takeaway, obviously, from what Maud has said is that you know that I'm old. And while I did not personally know Alexander Graham Bell, I have been around for a while and have been, quite frankly, very fortunate to have worked in a number of research environments that really fostered creativity to the nth degree. We have a saying, it's better to be lucky than smart. And I think that originated with generals, but my life, in a sense, has been evidence of that. I had the opportunity to work at some of the world's greatest research cultures, working as a grad student at Stanford, working at a Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, and then being able to work at part of the old Bell Labs system were really opportunities afforded to me that certainly changed the course of my life. And I'm very grateful for those things. And what I was hoping to do today, because I'm going to assume that our audience is people with a lot of entrepreneurial bent, as well as with a reasonably strong technical background. What I'd really like to do is talk sort of peer-to-peer to you, and maybe share a couple of life lessons that I've learned, and to do it all via discussions about the blockchain. But my real intent is to use a blockchain as a platform to try to pass on some insights that have been helpful to me that I hope will be helpful to you as you think about what you might do in the blockchain space. So with that as background, let me just launch in. I am going to show a couple of slides, and we're going to do a short live creation of a blockchain.
Yeah,
but I do that not so much to relive the glory days, but to provide some grist for the mill for the discussion that I hope is a fruitful one as we all kind of sit around a virtual table and talk about um, what it takes to accomplish the dreams that we individually have. So let me just retrace a little bit of what Mo had to say, and that is, it very much was a particular case of scientific research gone awry that started my interest in the creation of immutable records, records that could be trusted by any party, records that did not have the sense of an insider versus an outsider, but where we all felt that we were looking at an immutable record that somehow transcended the ability of any of us to alter it. And again, as Maud pointed out, it came out in this very very publicized, very public um, case of scientific research involving the colleague of a Nobel laureate. Now, the Nobel laureate's reputation was not in any way impugned, but it became clear that a collaborator of his had achieved seemingly very remarkable results in biology, only to find out that the results were so remarkable because they'd been made up after the fact. And the only way that people were able to detect the error was because they were able to look at the lab notebooks and they could tell the difference between the old ink versus the new ink that had been the source of the alteration of the data after the fact. And working and kind of living in the culture of Xerox PARC at the time, it gave me a sense to kind of look fast forward into where the future, where things were headed. And I realized that we were going to be living in a completely digital world where all the records were digital and therefore trivially alterable after the fact. And it really bothered me in a kind of existential sense. Who would want to live in a world where you couldn't trust any of the records that you were reading, where conspiracy theories could abound because you'd assume that anyone with power and control could alter their records after the fact and sort of rewrite history? And just the anxiety and uncertainty of that kind of a future was really dystopian to me. And it bothered me in a kind of deep way, apart from any particular, what was my job going to be? What was my career going to be like? It loomed larger than that for me. And I felt like it was a problem that needed solving so that we could have a world that we would be happy to live in. And so when I came east from Stanford and Xerox PARC to Bell Communications Research, one of the first things I did was to seek out members of the cryptography group and explain to them my almost obsession or my anxiety about this problem and the fact that it really needed solving now before it was too late. And so Stuart Haber, my more senior colleague, agreed that he would work with me on the project, even though I had no background in cryptography. And I think, if there's a life lesson to be drawn out there, one of the things is to worry less about whether you have the adequate background to do something, and to worry more about whether it matters enough to you to figure out something. And that's certainly been something that has worked well for me. There are always experts in a field that you can approach if you have something that is compelling and pressing. And it's just up to you to pursue it. So at any rate, I'm going to switch over now to screen sharing.
One quick question, Scott.
Please, go ahead.
Was Stuart already working on something, some variation of it, or once you joined Bell, then he started working on this? Did any of the researchers in Bell I mean, they were researching something about immutable digital data, or it's after we came in, then they started working on it?
All right. Well, that's a great question
Yeah.
for you to raise, and I'm glad that you're saying it because it leaves out an important part of the conversation.
Yeah.
So again, do we have the screen sharing working now?
Yes, yes, perfect.
Okay.
Perfect for me.
So the glory of Bell Communications research was that no one told you what to do.
Beautiful.
Your mandate in being hired was not to work on a particular project, but rather the assumption was you were the person that knew what the important problems were, and you were tasked with solving whatever you thought were important problems. It's really just hard to imagine as freewheeling a research culture as that was, and why that was really the opportunity of a lifetime. So again, nobody was talking about this issue. And I had no manager telling me to get back to what I was hired for, rather than, go off on this sort of crusade worrying about a problem for which I had no background. But it's also the case that I had started to work out a basic solution to the problem before I was hired. And when you are hired at a place like Bell Labs, or, again, Bellcore is a derivative of the old Bell Labs, you have this intellectual property disclosure form that you sign the first day that you show up. Okay. And basically, in exchange for $1, you agree that everything that you invent from this day forward is owned by the parent company. And at the same time, you have to disclose whether you're working on anything currently that predates your employment. And one of the crucial documents that I still retain is one where I sketched out a partial solution to this problem before becoming employed. It turned out to be a very impractical solution, but it was sort of terrifying to the Bell Communications research attorneys when we spun the company out that we had this document showing that maybe they didn't own the intellectual property. Anyway, so no, we came in a clean field environment, and it was the wonder of Bell Communications research was the fact that you could decide what your employment should be about by stating what you thought was an important problem and just working on it. So I'm sorry if that detour took too long to be responsive to your question.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect.
And so what you're seeing here on the screen, of course, is a slimmer and more handsome version of myself and Stuart in my office back there. And what really transpired was that Stuart and I spent a long time trying to address this problem when we came up with a sort of a semi-practical system. But we realized that the central flaw in the system was that you had to trust someone, that somebody, if they could be corrupted or bribed, could inevitably, or if their systems could be broken into, could inevitably thwart your efforts at creating immutable records. And I said to Stuart that this just isn't good enough. It will not stand the test of time. No one's going to believe 30 years from now that with absolute certainty, the central authority didn't have a chance to fake the records. What we need is a system that does not require us to trust any central privileged party, so that there would be no insiders versus outsiders in the system. And Stuart and I worked on this problem for several weeks, at which point Stuart sort of pulled me aside, being the more mature researcher, and said, "Scott, I don't think this problem can be solved." And I'd really like to get a publication out of all the work we've done. So why don't we write a proof of how it's impossible to set up a system that doesn't trust a central authority? And so I kind of reluctantly agreed to it because I felt like my dream was not going to be realized, but I understood the pragmatism of wanting to publish a paper. And so it was actually in the process of writing up the construction of how you prove that it can't be done that the solution came to us. Namely, we were writing a proof kind of by induction for those of you that have that mathematical background that basically says if you want to prevent the corruption of one person, then you need a second person to oversee them. But what if those two people collude? Well, then you need a third person to oversee them. And so the logical extension of that was that the only way you could build a trust-free system would be to have a collusion that involved everyone in the world. And since that was obviously ridiculous, you couldn't build a trust-free system. And it was at that point we realized that that was in fact how you did build a trust-free system, by essentially involving everybody that's a participant as a trusted witness to the process. And it was from that the notion of linking the records cryptographically and then distributing them widely to as many node participants as possible, that was the real solution. It was sort of turning the world upside down. It went from, it's obviously impossible to have everybody in the world in on a scam, into, but if everyone in the world is in on the scam, it's not a scam anymore. It's just the state of the reality of the system. And that was really the breakthrough idea. I just want to fast forward one slide. Here, of course, is the very first, to my knowledge, the patent filing that actually shows how blocks of records can be linked together and then distributed amongst its participants. So for those that are historical buffs, you might enjoy just seeing that. As Maud also alluded to, many people are unaware that something resembling a blockchain has been in continuous operation since 1995. There's my colleague, Stuart. But what I really want to do, and I'll try to do it quickly, is I want to actually build a blockchain right now with each of us actually able to participate on our individual smartphones or whatever in the making of the blockchain. And so I'd invite you to go to this website, Gazillion. Note this, there's no A in Gazillion. And we're going to construct a blockchain amongst us just so we can demonstrate what we're really talking when we talk about the essence of a blockchain. So let me, now when you get there, your screen is going to look just a little different than mine because I'm going to have to create the Genesis block to begin with. But what you're going to want to do, and actually maybe I will go back and show you, you should see a screen that says something like, it gives you two options, one above and one below, and the one below says something like, I want to join an existing blockchain and I already know what I'm doing, okay? And that's where you're going to end up. If you'll just let me create the Genesis block, then you'll have access to this chain. And what we're going to do, just to kind of make it fun, is we're going to try to predict the date that a first vaccine is approved for the COVID-19 pandemic, okay? Now, I'm going to put in my actual email address. You don't have to do that if you don't want to for privacy's sake, but I want to encourage you to put in a real email address, because if you do, then after this meeting, you'll receive a copy of the blockchain that we've created. Okay, so my prediction, I'm going to put in a brief message. I'm going to predict that a vaccine will be available. And just so I don't bias the situation, I'm going to predict that the vaccine will be available today, which we know is not the case. So this is deliberately putting me out of the winner's pool. And now I'm going to submit that record. Now, what's happened is there is a first node that now has received this entry from me, but the blockchain has yet to be built because there are not other participants yet in the node. And so what I now invite you each to do is you should be able to get into the Gazillion site, going into the existing blockchain, the one that's named, if someone has it on their screen, what is it called? I think it just says something like
Create
Dubai
blockchain.
GBA conference or something.
No, I have a screen saying that I want to explore on my own. I have a code to join an existing blockchain.
I have a code and I want to join an existing blockchain.
Yeah.
And now, once you've chosen that, doesn't it give you the name of the blockchain you're going to join?
GBA Dubai. Yeah.
GBA Dubai.
Yeah,
Okay, so go ahead and make your own entries. And go ahead, just for the fun of it, make your own predictions about when a vaccine will first be available. And what's happened is we already have one person that's already submitted their entry. Now we've had a third person. And as soon as now we've had a fourth person. And now we can begin to see the blockchain being built. Each of the individual people's entries has now been built into a Merkle tree and goes up to a root node. And if we get just a few more entries in, just a couple more, then we will start to link. There we go. Now we have 12 entries in. And so what's happened is each of these 4 entry blocks is now joined one with the other with the other. And I'm just going to give people a little bit more time to complete their entries.
So what consensus?
We're showing you how the blockchain, and again, this is the pre-blockchain or the proto-blockchain. This is the original thing that we built back in the early 90s. And I just want to illustrate how, even though it's not nearly as sophisticated as the blockchains we see today in their dozens, if not hundreds of varieties, that some of the essential features are there. Okay, so we've had 24 entries. I'm going to go ahead and now understand what this screen that you are looking at represents. Here's my individual entry. Here's my own personal copy of the blockchain. You also each have personal copies of the blockchain. Okay, it is no longer confined to any central authority. And I'm going to ask for someone to validate my document, my prediction. And what's going to happen is, under the control of no centralized system, there is a pseudo-random number generator that, based on the previous entries in the blockchain, will select from the 29 people that have entered that have their own personal copy of the blockchain, will select 3 of them at random to perform validation. So what just happened to 3 of you, namely, George, congratulations.
Yes.
And Dan and Joran.
George, you should take my lottery.
You were selected at random in a way that no central authority could influence. You were sent a copy of my document, and you were asked to compare it to your own personal copy of the blockchain to see if it is valid. So what you want to do, the 3 of you, is you should go to your screen and you'll see that there's a request for validation. Let's look at what George's screen would look like. So George, you need to click on this perform validation button, which you just did. Thanks. Okay. And so George just received, 1 surety credit for having performed that essential function in the community. And it looks like Dan has also, and Joran has also. So all three of the people chosen at random have validated that my entry was correct. And it's on the strength of our community-wide consensus that we believe it. Now suppose I decide that I was a little ambitious in the vaccine availability date and I want to get back into the money pool. And so I decide to change my entry. I meant May 31, 2021. Who would notice? You know, I tampered with the document. Now I request validation again. Again, 3 people completely at random will be chosen. In this case,
Sunit,
Chalfoni, and SA.
yeah.
Now, Sunit has done the community duty only to find that the receipt doesn't validate. There's a flaw in the chain, and that's highlighted in this red. Similarly, has anyone else
Shalfo,
has also found that my claim doesn't match against their personal copy of the blockchain. And what about SA? I want to encourage you to press this perform validation button so that you can compare your copy of the blockchain against my putative claim. If for some reason you're not able to find that, I can sort of go
SA,
to
I guess, yeah. I guess you can press it for
yeah,
SA.
I can press it. The point is, it's all but impossible as we increase the size of the number of people that we choose at random to ever conspire against the system. And this is a side point, but it's not limited to a 51% attack. Namely, this system is resistant to a 99.9% attack. A technical point that I don't want to spend any more time on. But what I do want to focus on, and this really is not at all about the technology, but rather about the social incentive here, is that something really remarkable has happened that Adam Smith himself would recognize. Namely, you know, Adam Smith writes about the notion of an invisible hand that somehow takes each of our own selfish interests and converts it into something that collectively creates economic surplus. And that is exactly what's going on with these validation requests. You each want to hold on to your copy of the blockchain in part so that you'll be able to prove that your claim about the vaccine was valid. But in pursuing your selfish interests, you help collectively create the consensus that makes the immutable record. And it's that alignment of disparate interests in a collective way that is really at the heart of why the blockchain works. And it should suggest to all of us what it is that's at the core of economic incentive in systems that create true value. They have a way of taking our selfish, unaligned interests and using that to their advantage to create a common pool of something, okay? In this case, of digital trust. And again, I don't in any sense want to lay claim to having done more than helped with the foundation of the blockchain. I mean, all of the additional work done by Satoshi, and to be clear, you know, let me say it in Japanese, Watashi wa Satoshi Nakamoto de wa arimasen, okay? It makes it clear that I'm not Satoshi. Of course, if I were, would I admit it? All of the work that's been done by Satoshi, by the Ethereum folks, and by just innumerable people working on variations of it, I give them all the credit for that. But at the heart of it all is this way of finding how to align disparate interests into a collective good. And that's really where the opportunity with the blockchain lies. Now, I want to just go to philosophize just a little bit about this issue. And for that, I'm sorry, let me just get this right. For that, I want to go back to a quote that I have always been guided by since the first time I saw it 40 years ago. Many people are unfamiliar with Daniel Burnham, but he was a very famous architect in his day. And he has two ties, I think, to the UAE that you might not recognize, okay? One is he was essentially the first or among the first 2 or 3 people to build a building so tall that they had to come up with a new name for it. And the name that they came up for his building was skyscraper, because they couldn't think of any way to communicate just how enormously bigger it was compared to the things around him. And second, he was a very famous city planner. And he had this notion that if you lay out a city the right way, with the right incentives, that it will happen. And so this quote of his, to make no little plans, to me is at the heart of really having an impact in the world for good. It wasn't just so I could have a job. It wasn't just so people would like me. It wasn't an attempt to, claim glory or anything. It was an obsession about working on a problem that really mattered to me and wanting to make the world a better place that really led to that whole idea of the creation of the immutable record. And I just am going to close out in transitioning over to the UAE, because when I think of the UAE and examples of entities that have made no little plans, I think obviously of the Burj Khalifa, but in a sense, it's not the height of the skyscraper that's the miracle. It's the fact that there is a thriving and vibrant city built around it, okay? If you want tall skyscrapers that don't share that characteristic, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this complete monstrosity that was built in North Korea, this enormously tall hotel that's never been finished, never been occupied, because the person may have been ambitious, but never went to think about, how do I create the alignment of everyone's selfish interests into creating a collective good? And so to me, the miracle here is not necessarily, as I said, the height of the skyscraper, but the fact that we have a thriving city here. Obviously similar stories can be told, and I'm sure they are often told in that area, about the growth of Emirates. But even more interesting to me is to think about the Mars Hope mission that I hope goes well, launching on July 24. It's really a launch into the future. And, here's the UAE saying, why say that the sky's the limit? Why not, try to move ourselves into the first tier of space exploration by, making no little plan and trying to accomplish something of importance. And I guess I just kind of leave it there with the question marks of, how can I help any and all of you to think about what you could build on top of the blockchain that can be similarly ambitious, but also successful? And so let me just kind of leave it at that.
Thanks for your wisdom and that presentation. It was quite really great. Let me just get back the screen first, and So we're gonna have we have lots of questions, and so I'm gonna ask questions, and also the panelists. First question, I want to go back all the way back. You grew up in 60s and 70s. It was during that time, first man went to moon. There was oil embargo. There was a huge Cold War, and also there's British music invasion. It was tumultuous time. And how was it like growing up during those days?
It's funny that you talk about those days because I have two very distinct memories. One of uh, what you called the British invasion. My older sisters were huge Beatles fans,
Wow.
and so I can still
And what about you?
remember.
What about you? What kind of music do you were into?
Um, well, it sort of defined the music that I was into. I had to follow the leads of my three older sisters, and I do remember very vividly the Beatles landing on the top of the broadcast. Must have been landing in a helicopter on top of a skyscraper in New York City so that they could get onto the Ed Sullivan show. But I also remember aside from all of the turmoil of the 60s, the landing on the moon was something that just dominated my my whole early days. It was the pinnacle of achievement because it was such an ambitious, audacious goal, and yet we simply willed it into happening. And again, it's something that one way to understand just how significant an accomplishment it was is that it's been 50 years and we still haven't been back to the moon. It was so forward looking. And it looks like SpaceX and others are going to get us back there, but it's hard to appreciate just how much was. Oh, that's a great slide. It's
Yes.
hard to appreciate just how much was accomplished until you realize that it's been 50 years since we were last on the moon. So.
Yeah, so I have like, it's great that you transitioned to this part. I just wanted to ask that like you told the culture about the Bell Labs. In today's culture, we don't see something like Bell Labs, and if you see the budget of NASA compared to the percentage of federal budget, it has been decreasing. So do you think the corporates are basically outsourcing innovations? That means they're buying up startups, or they said that okay, it's not worth it. It's after the Cold War. They're quite comfortable with the status quo. What do you think?
I think I would rather turn the question around.
Okay.
Namely, I agree that there has been a decline in the focus on enthusiasm for pure research. And we could, wring our hands about how unfortunate that is, but I think there is a much more important personal lesson to invoke, and that is don't wait for someone to give you permission to jump into something very big and ambitious. Okay? Don't lament that there's not enough funding for basic research. Instead, get up tomorrow morning and saying, come what may, I'm going to work on this big idea that I've been thinking about for years, but have never quite gotten around to finding the time to work on. That's far more important than worrying about whether some government or some culture is going to provide adequate support to nurture that. Simply decide to go ahead and do that thing that you've been putting off for so long.
Great.
Hey, Mo, can I just add something really quick?
Yes, Gerard, please.
This is really quick. Scott, thank you so much. Your stories are always inspiring. I've had the great benefit to hear you now at the United States Capitol and here, and I really appreciate so many of your contributions and your friendship. When you were talking about the quote, you reminded me of a quote from Theodore Roosevelt, right? And I think this really kind of embodies what you're talking about and what you're inspiring people to do. And Theodore Roosevelt said, "Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to take rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy nor suffer much, because they live in a gray twilight that knows not victory nor defeat." Right. And when I hear your story about really realistically impacting the world, right? Because you saw something that needed to happen. I'm just inspired, and I've got sort of a corollary to that. Mario Andretti, and this, they do a lot. They got some races there in Abu Dhabi. Mario Andretti, a famous race car driver, one of his quotes was, "If everything's under control, you're not going fast enough."
Yeah, yeah.
I just wanted to add that because and just to share how inspirational you are and have been, and impactful. And Mode, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, thanks. Um, so, so before I go to this more questions, uh, yours is very interesting. You are about to write how it's not possible without a third party, and then you stumbled upon a solution. But this is the first paper you wrote, and I read the paper. It's very interesting. But there are two poems, and I'm a fan of Roman Republic, so and this is a poem from William Shakespeare. It basically references to, if those who don't know, it was, there was a noble woman. Her name was Lucretia. She was assaulted by the king's son. Enraged, the noblemen drove the king, the monarchy, they overthrew the monarchy. And from that day onwards, the republic was born, and they didn't want one person to hold all the power. Uh, and second poem was again from Roman poet, but who will guard the god themselves? So are these two lines alluding to transparency? If yes, how important is transparency in today's world?
Okay, well, that's a great question, and let me just say,
Yeah.
without equivocation, that it is absolutely about transparency. It is about um, it is about making more information available more broadly. That is really the path to value creation, and it's it's the levelizing influence that comes when we all have access to the same data. It means it decreases the likelihood that we individually will be a winner.
Mm.
Namely, there's that natural tendency to want to selfishly hoard the data and be in control of it. But
Yeah.
it greatly increases the likelihood that we will collectively be winners. And so, yes, it is very much about transparency.
Great, great. Um, there's another one I want to show you, which was basically on the use case. Let me just see. This was a research team found out. Uh, it was basically the use cases you presented to an investment firm in 1993, and thanks to your wife, she saved this.
Where did you
These are
find that?
basically use cases of the proto blockchain, and which is almost even relevant today. So my question is, you and Stuart have been working on blockchain use case way before anybody of us. So what is one thing blockchain is not doing, you would love to see implemented, blockchain, solve the problem? Which sector, which niche you think?
Well, let me just say, I mean, there are many, and
Okay.
I haven't mentioned it to this point in the conversation, but understand that right now my day job is as a partner at a venture capital firm,
Yeah.
and our focus is on the enterprise blockchain space. And I'm not saying that in order to as an advertisement, but I'm saying that in the sense of our day-to-day job is finding viable use cases. And so um, it's a very hard task to um, to make truly viable use cases. It's all down in the details. It's working a lot of time trying to understand other people's needs. It's a hard and not very glamorous business of finding good use cases.
Mm,
But one simple use case that I think it's just astonishing to me that we don't see more use of it is, as a public, we should demand that existing corporate records, if not be made fully transparent by putting them on the blockchain, and I can understand why there are lots of confidentiality and privacy concerns, they should at least be registered into the blockchain so that when the time comes 10 or 20 years from now where we need to examine those records because of something that is you know potential misdeeds that need to be investigated, we should be absolutely confident that those are that the records we're looking at are the ones that were created 20 and 25 years ago at the time they claim, and not altered since. And so the simple audit improvement to existing internal corporate records and internal government records so that they can't be changed after the fact is, in my mind, the single simplest use case that is simply not getting the attention that it deserves.
Yes, yes. Also, one more thing. Other than government and non and corporate, there's one more sector, the nonprofit sector, um, which I think will immensely improve the trust, to donate. So so that's one sector. What do you think about? Would it immensely improve the trust
Yes,
and
I
also
agree.
the reputation? Yeah,
The reason that I'm drawing the distinction, what you say is completely true, but when it
yeah,
comes to the nonprofits, there's really no excuse for not making the record not just
mm,
registered in the blockchain,
yeah,
but putting it out on the blockchain. And the
yeah,
distinction I'm making is a record that in almost every instance there's no legitimate reason for keeping it private or confidential, and that if these government or non-government these NGOs and charitable institutions have no hidden motives and are fair to all concerned, then there's no reason why essentially 99% of their records shouldn't be visible and available to the public. And it could greatly increase the amount. The transparency would go hand in hand with increasing the trust level
great,
for
great.
these institutions.
So now I would start ask the panelists to ask questions. So the first I would go with Gerard. Um, so Gerard, if you could unmute yourself and ask the first question. Gerard, you're there. Okay, let me ask George.
Hey, first, it's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to connect with you, Scott. I have been involved in IT for over 30 years, and every time we have IT as a technology and we build a system, well, the real value comes from the use cases that we actually make with this technology at the end of the day. So the value that we create. Blockchain, when it started, it was about enabling digital currencies. Then it evolved into things like supply chain, which was primarily by things like smart contracts and so on. And today we're evolving into the area of what I would call tokenization, which is really, we can call this the internet of value, or creating a shared value of this internet value. What is your thoughts on, for example, tokenization, real assets like, for example, real estate or others, and the value that the blockchain does to tokenizing these assets?
Great. I want to answer two questions that are sort of, I want to answer the question you asked, but I also want to speak to the importance of use cases, because in my opinion, so much of the reason that we haven't seen as much progress in the space is because we focused too much on trying to get the perfect protocol and not nearly enough on getting the right use cases. And so I just can't overemphasize how creating value in a very well-tailored use case for a very specific application so dominates compared to getting the protocol a little bit faster or a little bit whatever. Okay. Now, specifically to the tokenization of um, of real estate and other physical assets or assets that are not on chain. Yes, I think it has a terrific future. It fundamentally comes down to, and I probably use the word fundamentally too much, but you have to understand my training was as a physicist, and it's all about kind of throwing out all the noise and finding out what's really going on at the most fundamental level. And when you turn to business situation, it means what are the fundamental economic drivers of value creation? And fundamentally, what laissez-faire doctrine is telling us is that capital will be far more efficiently allocated if individuals make decisions that are well informed about the options available to them. And so anything that we can do to reduce the friction in the system that allows us to allocate resources, like what happens due to tokenization of something like real assets, like real estate or something, can increase the ability of the market to function efficiently. We talk about siloed data, but there's also siloed physical assets that are not getting allocated to their best use because they aren't liquid. And making non-liquid assets more liquid is a net win for all of us. Yeah.
Great. So Gerard.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had to step away for a moment, and Maud, I apologize. I'll have to jump off in a little bit, but I do have a couple questions for Scott. Scott, from the early days of when you started thinking about this, and then later on when you started hearing about this, the Satoshi guy and Bitcoin, and as you've watched, Ethereum and the ICO craze, and you've sort of watched the progression where I see things now is almost a fork in the road, pardon the pun, where there's a lot of enterprise blockchain activity, right? And for very good reason. And there's a lot of very open, public, decentralized blockchain activity, right? And so my question for you is, do you see this as a competition? Do you believe that the large organizations, institutions that have had monopoly over certain things like financial systems or data, the Googles of the world, the big banks, do you see this as some sort of a competition, and one will win out? Do you think there's a place for both? Can you talk a little bit about the concept of the centralization or decentralization of power, right, as it relates to this technology?
Right. So again, I know that this is an almost religious kind of debate, and let me just sharpen it a little bit by characterizing it as the sense on the part of many who are idealistic about decentralization and democratization, that they view existing centralized authorities co-opting blockchain technology as being somehow a catastrophe. And I fundamentally do not agree with that. I think that instead we should view it as insinuating a technology that is inherently democratizing and decentralizing, that we are insinuating it into these existing systems. And that while those that choose to adopt it within those systems may think that that can only increase their control, I think they are mistaken. I think they will find that the technology kind of has a power of its own. And if I say any more along those lines, you'll know what a Lord of the Rings fan I am. That it has a sort of power of its own that will ultimately decentralize things, even if it's rapidly adopted by existing centralized players. So I absolutely do not see it as a negative. I see it as an intermediate state when you see these players adopting blockchain to their own interests. I think fundamentally we will get broader and broader and more delocalized as an inevitable consequence of the technology, no matter who is playing with it.
Great, great. It's localism, the power to the localism. It's anti-globalism, yeah. So our next questioner is Saeed. Saeed, you're there?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
I'm
All
here,
right.
Mo.
Let's just say, yeah. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Got very, very valuable knowledge that you've shared there. You know, your history in this industry is commendable. I mean, blockchain, at the current blockchain as we know it, for example, Bitcoin is only 10 years old, but it's very interesting to hear that there have been people that have actually touched upon the technology, the earlier version of the technology, if you like, for so many years before Bitcoin came about and before the current blockchain that, as we know it, was around. I've just got a couple of questions for you. First one is mainly focused on cryptocurrencies, the first use case or the first widely used case of blockchain. So my question to you is, do you think that Bitcoin will remain the dominant cryptocurrency out of all the ones available out there? And if not, then when do you see that dominance being overtaken by a different cryptocurrency? And which one do you feel it will be? Or if it doesn't exist at the moment, which one do you think it will be? What type of cryptocurrency it will be? And then another question for you would be, when you first started working on blockchain compared to, say, like 20 years ago, if you had to guess where we would be today, would you say today we've gone as far as you thought the technology would come about? Do you think it's as much adopted as you thought it would be, or do you think it's less than what you think it would have been, or do you think it's definitely being used much more than you anticipated? I mean, how do you see the growth of adoption compared to when you first started working on it? If you had to guess, you know, is it as you would have guessed, or more than you would have guessed, or less? And then in 10 years' time, where do you see the technology being?
So many questions in one question.
Okay, I've got that as 2 questions, and I'm happy to respond to them
I have to jump up.
in order.
You're like genie in the bottle, right? You have one wish. My first wish is to have 10 wishes.
Right.
So, okay.
Let me first speak about Bitcoin, okay? And again, I want to come down clearly on my feelings about Bitcoin, and I apologize if some are offended or no longer want to follow me on Twitter. I think Bitcoin is a work of genius. There is so much, not so much on the crypto side, but on the social incentivization side, that has worked well for Bitcoin, that we owe a lot to what Satoshi did. Having said that, to me, it is a genius work, more of art than engineering. And I think the time has very much come, in my opinion, that we honor Satoshi for what he did and then move on. And so I think the real contribution of Bitcoin is to, for the first time, give us a sense of what's possible. Okay. But I think on any objective view against the guidelines that Satoshi established for himself, Bitcoin has not succeeded as it was intended. Okay. And that there are some fundamental flaws in the thinking about social incentivization, largely around the mining concept, that I think we just have to recognize that it was a terrific first effort, but that doesn't mean it is an unchangeable, unimprovable system. I mean, Satoshi himself has acknowledged that he did not see the kind of mining pool centralization issue. And so I think Bitcoin is dominant because we just haven't seen a better solution. But I do think it will be superseded. Okay. Now, obviously, the more difficult question is when and by what. And the when, I think, is that will be obvious once it happens. I know that doesn't provide a lot of predictive power, but by what, I think there's a clearer answer to that. And I think that is, again, going back to actual use cases, I think that the notion of stable coins, which feel like a kind of halfway solution towards the goal of decoupling from nation state backed fiat currencies, I think it's the right intermediate step, because there's so many challenges to be overcome in order to create a kind of universal currency, that I think the idea of stable coins is a useful intermediate state on the way to that goal. And what I mean by intermediate is not intrinsically stable, but stable simply because they're trying to attach themselves to existing one or more or a basket of currencies. Purists would say, but you're still sort of selling out to the system. But it's hard to make a stable currency. And it's not a bad halfway point to gain the benefits of what is more frictionless and where more value creation can be made, namely in digital currencies, where you can build smart money and smart contracts on top of them. It's more important to get to the digital aspect of it than it is to try to solve the stability problem decoupled from existing currencies as an intermediate state. So that's my second answer. And then to your third question, which is has more happened than I thought would happen, or has less happened? I would say that unbelievably more has happened. I had a very expansive view of things, but it's very humbling being reminded that there's a lot of smart people out there, and the kinds of innovative ideas that have come out really are humbling. And you realize that even if you try to achieve something as ambitious as you could imagine, it gradually over time becomes dwarfed by the collective ambitions of a vast number of very thoughtful and creative people. So the ambition has been greatly expanded on. Now, coming back to the practicality, and this is more wearing my venture capital partner hat, people have been very, very poor in really sweating the details about use cases. They've assumed that the ideal will somehow carry them into the promised land without a lot of hard work about understanding very, very niche vertical markets and the very unique and specific needs they have for creating value. And just assuming that the technology alone would carry the day in some single wave is just an act of such hubris that it has really held up the successful and modest application of blockchain as a part of overall solutions into very directed use cases. It's just a bit egotistical, quite frankly, and it's not treating the custom, it's trying to wow the customer with revolutionary technology rather than putting the customer at the center of the issue and asking how best to serve them.
Yeah, thanks. You're right. They're creating solutions for the problems that don't exist. So we have like four guys lined up. So our next questioner is Kelsey. Kelsey, please.
Hi, Scott. Thank you so much. It's so good to meet you. I'm Kelsey Warner with the national newspaper in Abu Dhabi. I have to say this has been an inspiring reprieve from all the COVID-19 talk. So I'm sorry to say that I'm going to bring us back there. I just want to get your thoughts on, the world is coming out of the pandemic in the worst recession probably since the Depression. What role do you see blockchain playing in our recovery, and what to you is the highest service that blockchain can be in the recovery? And kind of back to use cases, honestly, but wearing your VC hat again, where are the opportunities going to come from out of this in our recovery?
Well, Kelsey, we spoke briefly before we were live and on the record about the fact that the pandemic has obviously been a terrible thing. And unfortunately, I don't think we've realized just how negative and long lasting the economic consequences are going to be. And it's a sad thing, but it is, we didn't have the option of we can't move to a planet where it didn't happen. Unless you know of some technology that I'm unaware of. And so we simply have to deal with the cards that we've been handed. And in that context, the pandemic as a shock to existing legacy systems can have a beneficial outcome. And what I would suggest is that this goes back to the issue of trust. We've built institutions for so long that rely on physical records and personal meetings and face-to-face interaction and the trust you have between yourself and a very close circle of physically proximate friends. And as a result, those are the institutions that have accreted over centuries, if not millennia, that are attuned to that meeting face-to-face and being very localized. And I think what the pandemic has forced on us is we have to give up on that, at least temporarily. And so we're forced into situations where we have to have conferences where no one is there, right? Like the one we're having now. And so as the situation relaxes, it gives us the chance to ask how much of what we've been doing in the past has proven to be truly essential, and what things did we find alternative ways of getting by that were non-localized or that did not require the face-to-face and local interaction. And I think their blockchain has entree because there is a level of trust that can be afforded across parties that have never met, that will never be physically local, physically adjoining, that the blockchain can afford. It doesn't have to be in any way localized. And I think we can now start to view those with fresh eyes and ask ourselves, well, since we sort of survived in this interaction at a distance world, maybe we can have trust at a distance as well. Now, you asked about specific use cases, and I've given so far just a very general answer. I really think there are opportunities that have to do, let me get a little more specific, with, for example, the supply chain, okay? We have global supply chains now. We don't know the farmer next door that we traded milk for wheat with. We have supply chains that involve a huge number of people that we will never meet. And the fact that we can create a transparent record that everyone across the world can agree on means that we can place trust in more decentralized and adaptable systems than has been possible before. And so I think that's a major area for opportunity. More generally, what I would say is we have to learn that if we will collectively share data as a kind of commons, then there are many value creating things that can be built on top of a pool of commonly shared data. And that's really what the blockchain affords. It's not unlike, and I apologize if this diverges a little bit from your question, but it is not unlike what happens with the open software movement, where we all contribute into the software and then we create this very valuable resource that we can all draw upon, okay? In a similar fashion, if we agree to pool our data in a way that we don't try to keep it so privileged and proprietary, but we'll pool our data, yes, it'll force us into an uncomfortable need to not rely on our existing rent-seeking behavior for our confidential data. But because it will create such a large pool of shared data, there will be so many new value-added applications that can be built on top of this shared resource that we're going to create a lot of long-term economic prosperity. So, yeah, it requires a little bit of a leap of faith to contribute into the commons, knowing that your competitors now will have access. But it really gets you to reorient yourself to think about value creation on top of a shared data pool. And the larger that shared data pool, the larger the collective prosperity.
Thanks.
I've got to sneak one more question in. I'm sorry, Maud. And this can be a really, really brief answer.
Love to. We have like less than 10 minutes.
Sorry. Okay, stablecoin. Facebook is right now ahead on stablecoin. What do you think of that?
Again, short of Adolf Hitler, I just don't see that any entity is purely evil. Okay. And so I know there's a lot of disquiet about Facebook trying to, push Libra because there are doubts about its ability to keep private what should be private and not abuse things. But again, I view it as an insinuation of technology issue. I invite Facebook and 100 other entities to try to create a better mousetrap and let the best mousetrap win.
Yes.
To me, trying to hold it back because we don't, like the particular person that is, trying to innovate is the wrong way to look at it. We should let it play out based on its merits of meeting actual needs, but let 99 other options as well compete in the marketplace of ideas and in the literal marketplace.
Yes, thanks, Scott. We have three winners of a competition we had, where we guessed who's going to come to a show, and we have three winners. The the first winner is Venkata. Venkata, please go ahead and ask your question, please.
Yeah, thanks, Raj.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Go ahead.
hi squad.
Hi.
It's an honor to be uh, to have you on this meeting. So
Yeah.
thank you. And my question would be on the cryptographic algorithms. So with the advancements in quantum computing, which might be a reality in near future, so how does the cryptographic algorithms evolve? Because the existing might break, and also how does the existing max can help it to solve that?
How does the existing what help it to solve that?
It's maths.
Yeah, the math is, I mean, what he means is quantum computing, I guess, can break the cryptography.
Sure. No, that part I understand.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I was trained as a physicist. I'm a huge fan of quantum computing. I think it's just, you know, it's a terrific thing. It's certainly not today. But in the long term, I don't view it as a threat or challenge. And that's both for practical as well as for idealistic reasons. One, you know, there's a little bit too much enthusiasm in the near term for quantum computing, both because it's going to take time to do practical realization, and second, because Shor's algorithm has so dominated people's thinking about what's possible, that we have to understand that as great a breakthrough as Shor's algorithm is, it's decoupled from appropriately quantum resistant mechanisms for public key cryptography, and more generally homomorphic encryption in a broader sense. And even there, at a more practical level, the fundamental strength of blockchain-based systems in particular are on hash functions, which are even more resistant to quantum computing efforts than the digital signature schemes. Finally, I just want to put a plug in to someone reading something besides the first paper that we wrote. Namely, if you read the second paper that we wrote that everyone references but no one reads, you would see that there is a way to perpetually renew the validity of blockchain records.
Nice.
That it's built right into the way we conceived of the system, that you can continue to renew them so that they will outlive any particular choice of technology. Sorry, that was a shameless plug for why does no one ever read the second paper?
No, it's okay. There's most people who don't even read the big white paper of Satoshi, but that's a claim. So, okay, thanks for the answer. The second one is Ashfaq. Ashfaq, please fire up. Yeah.
Thank you, Shanavas.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to Scott, one of the founding members of blockchain technology. Very happy. Scott, my question is related to the industrialization of the blockchain. So if we see in current world, if we own some fiat currency or some assets, and in some way we lose that asset or the currency, so we have a way, some way to take it back, either through court or some other way. But now in blockchain, if we own some maybe some crypto money or tokens for the assets, and in some way someone has the access to our keys and they utilize it, so apparently there is no way to reclaim it. So do you foresee any possibility in future that the crypto assets or the currency, once it's lost, we can reclaim?
Okay. I have two answers to that question. The first is, don't lose your keys. Put them someplace offline, multiple places. You know, print them out on a piece of paper. Don't lose your keys. And don't share your private key. But the second answer is yes, I very much think that it's not a technological question. It is the issue of having recourse and going beyond just code is law is a natural and inevitable consequence of the growth of these systems for them to be human and institutional usable. And there are lots of people working on solutions to this where it's not the technology that's hard, it's creating enough of a marketplace to make it viable to have these recourse mechanisms. So I'm very hopeful about, I don't see it as a particularly even challenging problem, just one that's going to take time to gradually work out recourse mechanisms while still preserving, for 99% of the cases, the efficiencies of automated handling, smart money, smart contracts. But in the meantime, print out your keys and put them, don't just put them under your mattress.
Yeah.
Don't be that guy.
So, okay, our last one is Maharaj. Please go ahead.
Mrs. Scott, it's an honor to have you with us today. It's been an energetic session from the beginning. I have one question that is not technical. You have left a corporate world and have been a teacher since 2009. And you see that today's education is dogmatic and it's supposed to prevent mistakes. Do you think we need more practical hands-on experience and encourage and learn from mistakes in terms of today's education, as you have in this education field for the past 11 years?
Right. Okay, well, you just made a big mistake because you just gave me the chance to talk about something that I have a lot of feelings about.
Okay.
And so you've just thrown gas on the fire here. Because I think educational reform is something that is sorely needed, is very dear to my heart. And fundamentally, we have to move from a system where we learn things in a way and because of the satisfaction that comes from learning them and the ability that it gives us to create, to become creators. I think the sort of almost punishment-based educational systems that are prevalent, what they really do is they just alienate most people to technology. And the solution is systems that are much more like apprenticeship systems or craftsmanship systems, where we obviously make mistakes. We're encouraged to experiment and to try. And then when we make a mistake, we're encouraged to learn how to come back and fix it, pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and just keep trying again. You know, we get a Hollywood view of success because we focus on, we want to celebrate the stories of overnight success and miraculous fortunes being created. But if we really want to learn about success, it's really learning about overcoming repeated failure. And so that should be just built in as a natural part of the learning process and not one that needs to be inherently discouraging. So I'm going to stop there, not because I'm not interested in the topic, but because I see that everyone is dropping off now that I've started to talk about education.
No, it's okay. So yeah, Thanks, Scott. What are the exciting projects you're doing right now?
Oh, well, again, you know, for us, it's getting down in the trenches and helping the companies that we've invested in to increase the value for their users and clients. And that's all about getting down into the details and not relying on the blockchain to save you, but rather just really trying to understand other people's needs and how they can be met. I mean, anyone that wants to look at the particular projects we're working on, you know, you're welcome to go to the website and see what we work on today.
One philosophical question: If you were to meet Satoshi, what do you tell him or her?
I were to meet Satoshi, I would say read the second paper because you want your blockchains to last for a long time.
So thanks, Scott. Our time is up, but I want to make one announcement before we leave. We have a huge session on March on Capitol Hill on March 25th to 26th, and we have GBA Annual Achievement Awards. Those projects who are doing great things with blockchain in leadership, innovation, social impact, and courage. So if you think any blockchain project is doing that thing, please feel free to email us about your favorite blockchain project. So in this session, close to 450 public and private sector leaders will gather, and you can socialize in the US Congress. But thanks, Scott, for your time. We have been humbled by your knowledge and presence, and I mean, our fans are really happy that you are here, and I hope to see you in person in Dubai sometime.
Well, again, it would be great to come to Dubai. I hope I made it clear from the beginning that the purpose of my talk was to try to inspire and you know, offer advice and encouragement to people that want to dream big dreams. And you know, I'm not trying to put myself at the center. I'm really trying to put each of those people that has some dream at the center of you know, a big future for them. And I'd love to come to Dubai and try to be helpful.
Thanks, guest. Thanks, Gerard. Thanks, Saeed. Thanks, George and Kelsey. And most importantly, thanks the audience for your time, and we would love your feedback. And this is Mohammed Shanawaz signing off. And keep safe distance, stay safe, and together we'll overcome the pandemic. Thanks.
It was a pleasure to be here, and we enjoyed. Thank you.
But I'd like to thank you for putting this together, and I'd like to thank you for your leadership there in Dubai. You have a great way of connecting global experts and people like Scott Stornetta to your community there, and also a shout out to, we got several other chapter leaders, Jorge from Germany and Sindhu, and who leads our banking community. So I would like to thank all of you guys for your leadership in making GBA the organization that it is. So
thanks, Kelsey, too. Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thanks all. Thanks, Scott. Good to meet you.